Well, fine, good afternoon all. This is Patricia, and I am traveling for history. I'm at the Salisbury Fish Hatchery here in Salisbury, Vermont, and across from me is Alan Moorhouse, who is going to tell us everything we ever wanted to know about this place. So, Alan, please take it away.
Thank you. So anyway, this is the Salisbury Fish Culture Station. Originally was called the Salisbury Fish Hatchery. It was built in around 1931. Or in production in 1931 for restoring fish population in the state of Vermont. Probably right around the turn of the century, populations of fish of trout were declining, and hatcheries were being built, like in Roxbury and Bennington, and in some other hatcheries in our state. So this was the first hatchery that was built away from a railroad. Now that's pretty significant because back then you needed, before automobiles, you needed a rail system. That's why Roxbury is right by a rail line. That a rail system would you'd load fish up into milk jugs, and the old metal milk jugs, and they would get travel along railways and find the nearest bridge, and away they went. So that was the way fish stocking was back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then we got the automobiles, and we started taking the same milk jugs and putting them in the back of an automobile and driving them places. So, and then we now have modern equipment and trucks with aerated tanks and insulated tanks that we can drive fish throughout the state. So, but this hatchery originally was in the 30s, and we get eggs from various places. I'll show you an interesting document right here. We have some old historic documents back from the 1930s of when we would get eggs from other facilities. These were from Gilbert Trout Company in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and we probably purchased these eggs, and this was from January 14, 1937. Wow. And it had a whole documentation of how many eggs we got, temperature, they were packed in ice and all kinds of the condition of the eggs. We still have kind of documents like this. We do this exact same stuff now. It's just more modern. But this hatchery was built, and this is I'm going to segue to like what we do now. We have really good quality water. We actually bought land. This is an interesting document from 1932. I found this in my emails yesterday. State buys more land at Hatchery. This was 9 acres, including spring purchase from Frank Hallman, who actually, some of his family worked here, adjoining Hatchery building in Salisbury. So we have about 40 to 60 acres. I think it's 40 acres of land over here, and then the Hatchery proper here, which was 9 acres plus where this little building is. And we have multiple springs in the woods there that were being used to run this hatchery, and it actually discusses some of the land following the course. In addition, there were 60 acres of land on one opposite side of the road purchased, which includes the bubbling springs from which the greatest part of the water supply comes. So that's why we're here. We have this good spring water. Historically, was here. So they said, hey, let's build a hatchery here. So we have some old fallen apart raceways in the woods and some ponds and stuff. And even when I started, we still had some dirt raceways across the road there that my old bosses used to raise fish in, but now everything's kind of more modernized, although we still have some, this is a historic building. This was built, it's still the same building as it was back in the 30s. And
What's a raceway?
A raceway that's a good question. A raceway is a long, trough, so to speak, that we have fish. Usually they're built out of concrete or fiberglass, or back in the day they were wood. We had, where this road is down here, we actually had wooden troughs that were built out of I'm sure plywood or whatever they had at the time, and caulked with oakum and all the materials of the trade, and had water running into. So it's a long race. It's just like almost like having a stream system for these fish. So the water would come in and the fish would orient in the current, much like an artificial stream. So we have these raceways, concrete, that are in the ground. So they're graded with the road, so you can look down and the fish are in those raceways. We have some inside that are raised up, and we have smaller rearing tanks, which would be long, maybe 16 feet long. They're about this wide, that we start the small fish in. So usually it's a smaller rectangular, section that we raise fish in, and then we just put them in bigger and bigger tanks. We also have circular tanks. We've started to use some circular stuff, because more modern fish culture is all about a circular system, recirculating the water where you can collect the waste a lot easier, and the fish, it's actually they do really well with a circular tank. A lot of trout do really well with circular tanks, but we have yet to transition to that. If you go to Roxbury, which is another old hatchery that was flooded out during Irene. They rebuilt that to more modern standards. They still have historic buildings there from the 1890s, but they have circular tanks, a completely modern system with these big 20-foot circular stainless steel
Wow.
raceways. They're like big swimming pools, pretty much. It looks just like a big swimming pool, but and they just they just run fish in them, and they're just, it's piped differently, and yes, it's how we kind of sort of have a mix of old and new here. A lot of our raceways outside were built, in the 60s or early 70s, and so we're still dealing with some older materials.
And that's Roxbury, Vermont.
What's that?
And that's Roxbury, Vermont.
Yes, Roxbury, Vermont. And then we have another hatchery in Bennington, which is equally as old. I think they were built just before us, maybe 1910. I think they came in, and they have old open raceways outside, and they have stream water. They have a different system. See, the thing is, we have springs here, which is good because we have this good quality, constant water temperature, which we can grow the fish constantly throughout the winter. Right now, other hatcheries are dealing with, their spring water or their stream water is freezing. They're getting these. So fish aren't going to grow when it's cold. It's just the way it is. So they can't grow their fish up, and we usually will stock our fish in the streams and ponds in the springtime. So this is our growing season right now. Our fish are getting bigger, and we're going to continue to grow them up until March and April. In May, when we start stocking, and but the other thing with the way so for years we went with stock with getting eggs from other facilities. Usually either our state, we had a few places that would produce eggs out of fish, and we'd receive them from them, or we'd get them from the federal government. Has a lot of federal hatcheries that they raise broodstock, adult fish that produce eggs, and we get those eggs from them. So we were doing that up until the early 90s. So in 91, we built a modern facility, which is now 20-something years old, 30 years old, Salisbury Fish Culture Station up in the Northeast Kingdom, up in South Hero, Vermont, up in the islands. They're a big modern facility, at least based on 1990s standards, and they were raising a lot of fish for stocking throughout the state. In that time, we became the brood hatchery for the state of Vermont. So we started to become, we're self-serving our own state. We have adult fish here we raise up, and we take eggs out of them. And the reason we do it here because we have the best quality water of all the state hatcheries. We have these
Wow.
These springs were actually converted to well sources. We actually have wells we put in the 60s. So we built some we built some raceways up top that I'll show you. They modernized in the late 60s, early 70s, and put 2 gravel pack wells in, which produce 650 gallons a minute offhand. It dried up all our springs, unless really wet years like this year. We had a lot of moisture, so we had some spring water coming back. But generally, that just converted our water source to we have to pipe it everywhere now. Which back then we did that, and we're still doing that. But that constant water temperature is good, clean spring water. I mean, you could bottle it and sell it. We have good quality water for raising trout. We also have good quality water for incubating eggs. A nice cold temperature, 48 degrees. So we can raise lake trout here. We can raise brook trout here. And those are 2 fish that a lot of hatcheries can't do because their water gets up in the 60s. So we can do that here. So we have lake trout broodstock here. We have brook trout broodstock. We have brown trout. We have 2 strains of steelhead rainbows and 2 other strains of rainbows. So we have like 7 different fish here, 7 different strains of fish. So it's all broodstock. We do raise some fish here for trophy trout stocking and some yearling stocking as well. But we're primarily an egg station right now. So, that's what we've been doing. And we take eggs from middle of summer all the way into January, even early February. And that's pretty much our main goal right now.
So the fish hatchery, and admittedly, I don't really know clearly much about them, but fish hatchery, the point is to take the fish and then restock ponds and
yes,
lakes?
There's a lot of different programs we do. Primarily, a good portion of our fish are what we call put and take. We put them out there, you take them home. How this whole operation is funded, I'll go segue back. Like I talked about the federal hatcheries. Well, you buy a fishing license, or you buy a fishing rod, you buy a fishing tackle at the store. There's a tax on that. That tax that's called the Dingell-Johnson Act. And that was, I forget what year that was in place, but I think it was a while ago. That went to that money goes to federal government into this pot of money that the feds run federal hatcheries. So a lot of times federal hatcheries were being built with this money, and then they were stocking places, or they were using their hatcheries for restoration purposes, like the White River National Fish Hatchery is a federal hatchery. They were trying to restore Atlantic salmon to the Connecticut River. Now they're restoring landlocked salmon to Lake Champlain, and as well as I think using some of their eggs for restoring landlocked salmon in Maine, and they do lake trout as well. Wow. So, it depends on the. So anyway, so that money we get, that money sitting, our taxes, that tax money goes there. We as a state have to sell licenses, fishing licenses, to get some of that money back. So if, we're trying to engage people in fishing and restoring fish at the same time. If it's some fishing is just put and take recreation stuff, where these streams have been impacted enough to where we'll stock certain stretches, like around here, the Middlebury River. The lower Middlebury River will be stocked. There are some wild trout in that system, not enough to sustain a harvest or a significant harvest. So we stock to supplement that during the summer. And then, usually those fish might still be around in the fall, but usually by then, they've already been caught out. But there's still a few wild fish to supplement. So the upland streams usually don't get stocked because they have plenty of wild brook trout. But we might stock a handful of places with brook trout, because brook trout is a lot of folks like to fish for brook trout. Our trophy trout program is 2-year-old fish. People like catching bigger fish, which, our state may not be able to handle, producing those big fish, consistently. So we're able to consistently put those fish out. Like we had all this flooding recently. That flooding affects wild trout populations. It'll drop that population for a couple of years, maybe up to 5 years. Wow. It'll take some time for those fish to come back, because those fish, the little fish might be completely gone out of that system. The big fish might be displaced. So they have to replenish. The wild trout will come back, and our biologists will monitor that. But to put a feather in our cap in the hatchery, we're still putting those fish out. We're still putting out the stock fish, so you still have something to fish for in those 5 years that might take to replenish those streams, and having other opportunities to fish. But then let's segue to Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain was a big effort to restore lake trout there. They were gone from the 1800s. Dams, pollution, you name it, caused issues, for salmon and the lake trout. Mostly, I think, pollution for the Lakers. And we started to try to restore those fish back, I think, in the probably even the 70s. But definitely by the 80s, there was a program to restore lake trout to Lake Champlain. And those fish were coming from other hatcheries. Some of those were coming from wild populations, like the Finger Lakes in New York, Seneca Lake in particular. They have a self-sustaining population that they take eggs out of, and I think they replenish them, but they go find eggs, fish that are swimming around. They go take the eggs out of the fish on a boat, out there in a lake. They don't have a hatchery, so they're taking a somewhat wild fish, and those eggs are coming into a hatchery setting. They may take some for replenishing their stocks, and then we got brood line from them, where we got whole batches of eggs for stocking Champlain. So that effort was going on in the 80s, and in that time we got a brood line from them, and we were raising those, and then I think we got a brood line out of the lake as well. Early 90s, we went and took eggs out of the lake, but during that whole time of the early 90s, the Lakers were out there surviving fine in Champlain. They're dropping their eggs in the bottom, but they're fertilizing, they're hatching out, and they're disappearing. And the biologists are scratching their heads. Our top, UVM biologists were looking at hey, what's going on here? Why aren't these fish surviving? We didn't really have a clue what was going on. Little fish would get about this big and just disappear, got eaten by something. So the Lakers are successfully spawning, but they weren't recruiting, as what we call it, to the fishery. So somewhere around that 2000 we took a newer brood line out of the lake in 2003. We took pairs of lake trout. We took 230. We probably took 200 to 300 pairs of fish out of the lake. We took samples out of each of those of mating. They took these eggs and brought them up to Ed Weed Hatchery, raised them up there and stocked them in the lake, and we kept a few for our own needs to replenish our brood line. And from that point, we were stocking more. There was a lot of successful Lakers dumping eggs out there, and we were collecting eggs for several years, stocking those fish in the lake, and we were starting our newer brood line, and we started stocking those in the lake as well. So it was a better refresher of genetics. The genetics got better for some reason being out in the lake. They just, started to figure it out. And then 2012, we started seeing, around 2012, 13, they started seeing natural reproduction they started seeing the naturally produced lake trout in Lake Champlain actually surviving beyond this little tiny stage. So they started becoming part of the fishery.
Wow.
You could actually sample them. And then they started seeing just every year up and up and up and up from I think 2015, 16, they were really saying, hey, this is something happening. And you could actually go back and look and say, hey, it's probably the fact that we were taking these eggs out of the lake at this point, and these better fish that had survived, and we had the brood line here, so there were survivors of those survivors, and we're stocking, and we're putting in the better genetics that had it survived in the lake. So we've got to the point now where the threshold of fish surviving is overtaking what we need to stock. So we've totally completely eliminated stocking lake trout in Lake Champlain now.
That's
we're
amazing.
Done. So it's we're cracking. You should be cracking the champagne now. We survive lake trout. We talk about Lake Champlain as being this dirty lake and it's polluted and stuff, but we have lake trout surviving. We've got a landlocked Atlantic salmon that are reaching, our state record size again. Because of lamprey control. We're doing all these things. There's lakers out there. You just throw a line out there, you catch lakers. I was out there fishing a couple weeks ago. Laker. That's it, and they're little wild ones this size, beautiful with all their fins, and then there's still a few. Fin clipped ones that are stocked ones. We take a fin off so we know what year class it is. And there's still those out in the lake. But yeah, it's becoming more and more wild, self-sustaining fish that are surviving enough to spawn. So that's just going to, it's like replenishing the turkeys we did in this state. We put a few turkeys in, we put some more turkeys in. But truthfully, what happened? What light switch got turned on out in the lake to make them survive? I don't think we're even going to figure that one out because maybe the lake got cleaned up enough. Maybe those spawning reefs are cleaner, or just those fish are hardier for some reason. They're a good survivor now, and we've just got a good mix. So yeah, we have lake trout broodstock now at the down back that we're like, we may not need them anymore, and we might be able to use that space for something else. And it's a good thing for us, and that's kind of what that's our goal in that sense. It worked for the Lakers, and now it's like, okay, maybe we should be looking at some other thing we can restore. Maybe we should look at a different brook trout brood line that survives better. Like now we're doing a study. We have rainbows. Rainbows are a non-native fish. We're doing a study right now with two different strains. We have this one old strain that we got when we had a well failure, and we lost the fish we had, which worked pretty good in our culture system. And we had to get a new strain, which spawned a little earlier. It spawned in August, September. It's kind of a weird time for these rainbows to spawn, but they had been manipulated. They're like the mutt of the fish world, the rainbow trout. So we got these fish on, and they grow fine. We stock them out there. They get caught, but they will not hold over in our pond. So the other program we have would be put, grow, and take. We have like the put and take. We have the restoration like the lake trout, and then we have the put, grow, and take, which would be done more. We put fish out there. We want them to get bigger. We want to put a fish out this big, and then they're going to grow naturally to this big or whatever, and then you can harvest them. That's kind of a lot of our ponds are that way, in ponds that have smelt and good population. Lake Bomazine's another one. A lot of Northeast Kingdom ponds are like that. So these rainbows that these older strain we were using just were not surviving in these ponds. It's like they would live that year and that's it. You wouldn't find these bigger rainbows, or at least enough of them to be recruiting into that fishery. We're like, this is, we'd like to have a better fishery. So our biologists a few years back, about 6 years ago, we're like, hey, let's get something different. So we're doing a study now. We just finished the study, pretty much done with the study on the biologists, and we have this new strain called the Eagle Lake Rainbow, which are more of like a wild fish. The strain we used previously with the Irwin R. Lee strain, they're like a hybrid cross from the federal government that just, was spawning at a weird time, but it grew, and it kind of was genetically I think was inferior. I mean, in several respects, and it's not really, it's really highly domesticated fish. It's just like throwing chickens out there in the woods and hoping they survive. That's not going to happen. So these Eagle Lake rainbows were actually from Eagle Lake, California originally, which has a population that they're actually trying to restore, but they still have a self-sustaining population out there to a point. They have fish that are spawning, but these fish are used in several hatcheries out west, and one of the federal hatcheries out there in Montana has Eagle Lake rainbows. So we were able to get those fish for several years. For 3 years, we were getting production eggs, which would be fish that we raise up to size and stock them, and we get a brood line, which is fish we would retain for taking eggs out of them. So we got brood line eggs from them for 3 years, and we're currently working with those fish and spawning them at certain times. So we have the eggs we need for our programs, and we're segueing into that. Our biologists did studies, and it sounds like they're doing slightly better than the Irwin Arleys, and we're still figuring them out. I think they'll be fine, and I think you'll see some better rainbow fishing here, knock on wood, in the years coming up. So that's one of the programs that we do. We're just trying to manipulate different things like that. Like brook trout might be the next one we think about. We put in a certain domestic brook trout now, which does okay, but it doesn't survive, some of these ponds. And, there's ponds where, we have brook trout. It'd be nice to have them survive and get big, and not just put and take all the time. Or just, you could reduce your stocking. If those fish hold over, you could actually reduce the stocking, save money if you're not putting as many fish in there. Like Dunmore gets, 800 salmon every year, and they hold over and they get big. And those come from the federal government, actually, the Eisenhower National Fish Hatchery. So that's kind of a lot of our different programs, but a lot of it is just for fishing. It's a fishing in walleye was another one. We've tried to restore walleye, and that was a native fish, and that's we're doing some. They do intensive culture of walleye up at Ed Weed. At this size, those are a fish you can't raise them up like this. They get this big and they start eating each other.
Wow.
So it's a different critter. Bald Hill's doing the same thing, trying to raise walleye, and there's certain ponds where walleye are native, like Champlain they're native, and then they've reintroduced them to certain ponds up north where they've been naturalized for years, so they just kind of perpetuate those populations.
So, question back to Lake Champlain, when the 200 to 300 pair fish were, so what was the person who was selecting them looking for to select these fish?
Actually, basically just randomness. You got to really be random. You don't want to. That's where you get into problems. You don't want to. You want to pick decent fish. You don't want to pick a fish that has a missing fin, or deliberately crooked tail, or some kind of genetic defect, because they're going to perpetuate that. And you can look at a fish and say, okay, this one's inbred or has some issues. And generally out there, you're probably those fish have already been selected from the wild. That's part of it. Like if we put a fish out there this big, stocked, that fish has been selected already in the hatchery. It hasn't been challenged by nature. So you're throwing it out there and then critters are going to chase it around. But out there, those fish that have been surviving as a wild fish, they're being selected when they're little fish. So so you think that's how selection, basically how you're selecting works. I stock big brown trout. I stock my broodstock brown trout in lakes. By the time I'm done with them, I'll stock them as a ice fishing product. Something that you can fish from the ice. But they're not really going to key in on bait fish as much as you would think a little fish would, because they've been domesticated for 4 years. It's like they know me as boss, so they're going to follow me back for the pellet. They're not going to run away from me. They're going to follow. You'll see that when we go down here. You'll see fish come rushing right up the raceway. Those fish have been domesticated. Some fish we have are more domesticated than others. So in that sense, they're just picking the best looking fish. But. Okay. You don't want you do want some randomness in your spawn. You don't want them to be all big, because everything but out there, if it's big, it's probably going to be a survivor. If they were, like for me, selecting fish here that have always been domesticated, you don't want to just always pick your bigs, because you might be missing something in the middle. There might be some genetics in the middle, that are better, that are genetics you need. Obviously little tiny fish are probably not going to survive, so those are poor doers anyway. So, but being in the wild, there's a more natural selection. They're being selected naturally, and that's even when we had holdovers. We initially put the Lakers out there. Whatever survived. This was interesting when they go back to this what survived initially in Lake Champlain. They did genetics before we took these newer lines from Lake Champlain. It's been stocking for years. They looked and said, like 80% of the fish, it was almost might have been at least 80%, if not more, were Seneca strain lake trout. Those fish that came from Seneca Lake in in the Great Lake or in the Finger Lakes, and those are the fish that we were going and collecting by boat. And we sent a guy over, they get eggs, and they ship them back here, and we'd incubate them, and then we stock them in Champlain. So there were 80% of the fish on in Lake Champlain that had survived were Seneca Lake, and then like 10% were like Jenny Lakes, which is a place in Wisconsin. We had gotten eggs from Jenny Lake, Wisconsin, back in the 80s. There was a little component of them swimming around out there, and then we had Winnipegs, which was Canada. My boss and my two previous bosses, they went to Canada back way long time ago in the 80s, came back with eggs. They're sitting there with a bucket of eggs on the border, like, what do you got? Oh, fish eggs. Huh. All right, let's go. It was back in the day when, it wasn't the way it is now. There's no way you could be pulling eggs across the border like they did. But yeah, they drove up to Winnipeg and got eggs. But there's a small component of those fish. But those, whatever traits those had, most of them didn't survive. Those fish, for whatever reason, maybe they weren't disease resistant. I mean, each fish, some fish are more resistant to disease than others. And it's just the way it is, where they've been grown or not grown. And the Seneca Lake fish seem to be the ones that are the strongest fish. And now I think they do the genetics now, and it says like most of those fish are Seneca Lake fish. That's the genetics. The genetic code is Seneca Lake fish. They can compare the genetics now. Everything's DNA now. You can compare the genetics of the wild Lakers out there, and it's close to being a Seneca Lake fish.
Wow.
So if we ever needed to